Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Keele for the latest in our inaugural lecture series. My name is Christian Mallon, and I've got the privilege of being the Pro Vice-Chancellor Executive Dean for the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. Inaugural lectures are one of the highlights in our academic calendar. They really give us the opportunity to understand more about the work somebody's doing, and more importantly, the opportunity for family, friends, and colleagues to come along and join in the celebration. Tonight's lecture is delivered by Professor Sara Muller, who's Professor of Epidemiology and Statistics in the School of Medicine, where she leads the biostatistics team, although she spelt it 5 different ways on her biography, so I'm not quite sure if I've got that right. She's a Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, a member of the Society for Academic Primary Care, and has won several prestigious research prizes, including those from the Royal College of General Practitioners and the British Society for Rheumatology. I'm particularly proud to have the opportunity to introduce Sara's lecture tonight, as we've worked together for almost 20 years, although clearly neither of us look nearly old enough for that to be true, Sara. Sara is the only person I know who submitted a paper for publication that was immediately accepted without any revisions. That's a real feat in academia. The really funny thing was, it's about a subject we know nothing about, isn't it, Sara? It was all asthma, which is very unusual. Sara's everyone's favourite person to work with. She's intelligent, committed, and has a real knack for turning random ideas from clinicians into solid science that have impact. She also has the unusual distinction of being a statistician who has a reputation in a clinical area that's world-leading. So well done, Sara. So please join me, everybody, to welcome Sara to deliver her inaugural lecture tonight on polymyalgia rheumatica. Sara.
Thanks, Christian, and thank you everyone for coming. Just spoiled my title by telling everybody what it means. No, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure really what to talk about in some ways, because I have got lots of bits of things that I've done over time that have sort of accumulated into a career, but that don't necessarily follow a single path. And so I think there's 3 things that I wanted to draw out in what I want to talk about. One of them is words that you don't understand the meaning of, like polymyalgia, but I mean, it's not necessarily easy to say or spell, or neither is biostatistics, I can't type. I also wanted to talk a little bit about working with different people, even when they're not necessarily doing the same thing that you are, or you don't think they are. And finally, a little bit about developing other people. And by that, I mean people who've supported me, but also me supporting other people, because I think that's the best way that we can do good research. And I'm not going to say, this is what I mean by this all the time, but hopefully those things will come through. So I started my career choosing an undergraduate degree in maths, and I went to the University of Sheffield. Now, I chose maths because I didn't really like the idea that I was looking for somebody else's right answer. I liked the idea there was a right answer. And now when I look at what I'm doing, that seems really silly, because there's definitely no right answer. And I didn't think I wanted to do any statistics because I didn't enjoy it at A-level, but actually I ended up doing the majority of my course with statistics by the 3rd year. But what I forgot to say is, before I even got near the maths department, which is that building in the slides, I met Paul, who is now cringing somewhere over there. So the first day I arrived in Sheffield to do my degree, I met my now husband. And so we're doing all right, because we're now like 25 years on. And then the other important person that I met was a lecturer called Dr. Nick Filer, who's sadly no longer with us. And he taught medical statistics in the final year of my degree. And he was just really enthusiastic. It wasn't something I thought I wanted to do, but he had a website that had a list of funded master's courses on it, and I'd never thought I wanted to do a master's. But he sent a few of us off to AstraZeneca for the day to learn what it might be like to be a pharmaceutical statistician. They didn't recruit the year I graduated, so that didn't come to anything. But to go and work for a pharmaceutical company, you needed a master's. And so I used his list on his website to make applications, and he wrote me a reference, which was very kind of him. And off I went to the University of Reading, to do an MSc in biometry, and I did think when the prospectus arrived that I might actually have got the prospectus for the wrong course, because I wasn't really sure what biometry meant, but it turns out it's statistics applied to all things biological. And I found that year really difficult for lots of reasons. Paul sent me back at Christmas saying, yes, you are going to finish that course. And then Professor Sue Todd, who was the course programme director, said, I sat down with her and said, I think I want to go home. No, you don't. So thank you very much to everybody who persuaded me to stay. And having decided to stay, I thought I'd better look for a job. So I was looking for a job while doing my project at the end of my Masters that was about population genetic drift in Komodo dragons and skinks. That's translated really well into what I do now. But I did find out that Komodo dragons, those ugly things on the top, people thought they were poisonous for quite a long time, but it just happens that they have really dirty mouths. So if you get bitten by one, people thought they were venomous. They're not, they're just disgusting. So I'd applied for a job here at Keele as a research assistant on the Norstop project. And I went for my interview with Professor Peter Croft and Professor Elaine Hay, and also with Elaine Thomas, who seems to have disappeared from the internet and I couldn't find a photograph of. And they interviewed me, and I presented some work. We had to do a presentation on your recent research. Well, I hadn't done any because I hadn't had a job yet. And I presented some work from a master's project about rats. And I can't remember anything else. It was about rats, but I presented a t-test, which, for those of you that don't know, is a way of testing statistically whether there's a difference between two groups. And I got to the end of the presentation. I thought it was fine, and Peter says, so what do you need to tell whether there's a statistically significant difference between those two groups? And I hadn't put a p-value on the slide, which, if you know what that means, then you'll know what that means, but it was quite bad, really. Anyway, but I did realise what he meant, and I corrected myself. And I was offered the job to come and work at Keele at the end of my Masters as a research assistant. And I have to say that my good friend Elaine also applied for that job, and we were lucky that we both got to come and work here and have been working together, or in parallel mainly, I think, ever since. And so that led on to the first paper that I ever wrote, which was led by Elaine, who still doesn't have a photograph. And it was published in Pain, and relatively easily. It was a cross-sectional study. It wasn't overly complicated, and that really set, my thoughts incorrectly about how easy it is to publish an academic paper. And alongside working on the project, Elaine had said to me, well, you need something that's yours. And she wanted me to look at ordinal regression. So we're quite good in epidemiological studies at modelling things that are binary, so yes or no, you've got the characteristic or you haven't. And more in trials, I suppose, we're quite good at measuring things that are continuous. But when something's in between, we're not so good at that. When we ask people to respond in a series of categories, and then what we tend to do is chop the categories we've asked them about. So we might have given people 4 response options, like in this picture, and then we split it into 2 and analyse it like that because it's easier. And Elaine had said to me, why don't you look up how we can do it better? So I spent quite a bit of time doing that. And by this time, I'd joined the Royal Statistical Society, and I joined their special interest group for primary care statistics. And I was at a meeting in London in the days when we used to go to places, to go to meetings instead of going on Teams. And somebody said to me, would you like to come and talk about something at our local group in the southwest? Because the Royal Statistical Society has regional groups, and they meet regularly for talks. So I went all the way to Exeter and back in a day to do a 1-hour talk. And this is what I'm going to point out. This is about talking to people in different disciplines. So the person that invited me was in this primary care meeting with me. But when I got there and I talked about what I'd been doing, they all said, oh, but we do that all the time. We're all meteorologists, and we do lots of ordinal modelling, and I felt quite silly. But it was a useful lesson to know that sometimes it's helpful to talk to people that aren't doing what you're doing, because it felt quite novel in health, but it really wasn't novel if you were into weather and things like that. And that work went towards my PhD, which I started part-time alongside continuing to work on the Northstock project. So my PhD was nested in that project. And I put my project was about locomotor disability, and I used that ordinal work that I'd been doing in there too. And the idea was, this is George Peat, for those of you who don't know. He was one of my supervisors, along with Elaine Thomas. The project was to say, instead of dichotomising, let's measure things better. So let's be more accurate in how we measure things. So we're not just going to say somebody has a disability or they don't. We'll say how much disability do they have. And that led me to doing something called rash analysis, which is what creates those graphs in the middle. And I got to take this work, partially completed work, to a conference in Washington, DC. I went on my own for a week, which, when I think about it, one, it was really luxurious. I was discussing with a current student that I'm supervising that going abroad now isn't really something that happens a lot. And I presented this work, but I'd been sat there for a couple of days watching other people present their work using the same methods before I stood up, and I thought, I've done it wrong. And I got up in this meeting. It was probably about this sort of size. It wasn't huge. And I said, this is what I've done. It's my PhD. I think I've violated the main assumption of this modelling technique. And this man puts his hand up and he says, yes, you have. But I'll help you fix it. And he sat down with me and he told me how to make it so that it would work, realising that I didn't have a lot of choice other than to do something with this data because it was my PhD. And it turned out, so remember I said this was called rash analysis. This very nice man was called David Andrich, and he had had his PhD supervised by Georg Rasch, who had invented the technique. So I at least felt that I'd got some good advice. So I successfully completed my PhD, and I did a very short detour to the University of Manchester as a postdoc, which resulted in this paper that's the only paper I've ever had in the BMJ, and taught me lots of things. The whole trip taught me lots. This paper did. I was working for what is now a spin-out company for the university. I discovered while looking it up last week, and it wasn't for me, and I think that's probably why it wasn't for me. So very quickly, I was really fortunate to come back to Keele. I mean, within a year I'd left and come back again. And this time I was working with Christian and with George on a range of things. I think largely working officially on Christian's PhD work to make sure it was all, he had a very big project for his PhD, making sure it all got published. But doing lots of things, including the paper right at the top is the one Christian referred to earlier, that was accepted without revisions, which doesn't happen, especially when you don't know anything. Well, I don't know anything about asthma. I'm not saying Christian doesn't, but I don't. But the point of this slide, which I realise isn't necessarily very easy to look at, is I got to work in lots of different topics and with lots of different people. And I think as a statistician, that's something that's really nice to do, because you're not restricted, if you're working in health research, to a particular area, because statistics port quite well across different topics. And so, I'm coming to my title now. When Sam gave a talk, and I don't know when this was, probably around 2011, I think, in the lecture theatre in the medical school, around polymyalgia rheumatica and giant cell arteritis, I wasn't flummoxed by the long words because I'd already heard lots of them. I did think when you talked about giant cell arteritis, you might have meant arthritis, and I thought, no, you can't do, because you know what you're talking about. But it's quite confusing when you hear these words and you're not sure what they are. So this is where our work on polymyalgia rheumatica started, with Sam and Toby, who did his PhD in this area, and with Christian. And I was very fortunate to be awarded a postdoctoral fellowship from the School for Primary Care Research. But it was unusual as a fellowship compared to what you might be awarded now, I think. So it was very open. The title was The Diagnosis and Prognosis of Inflammatory Conditions in Primary Care. So that doesn't really tell you anything at all about what I was going to do. And there wasn't really a plan in it for what I was going to do. So I ended up with two streams of work. One was about early symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis, which I'm not going to talk about, but there's a paper if you want to see it. And the other thing was the PMR cohort study. Now, this was Christian's funding, not mine. It was from Arthritis Research UK, and our aim was to understand the epidemiology of polymyalgia rheumatica in general practice. So again, really broad. And we had lots and lots of objectives to that research. Now, this was my attempt at a study logo using word art. And it was, so for those of you that don't know what polymyalgia rheumatica is, it's a relatively common inflammatory condition. It affects people over 50. The average age at diagnosis is about 70. And it causes pain and stiffness in your shoulders and your hips. And people will describe waking up one morning not being able to turn over in bed. It can be very disabling and quite sort of, I think, frightening for people when I've spoken to patients. So that was my attempt at painful shoulders. I asked Copilot last week to draw me a better logo. I'm not sure it's no more accurate, but it looks a little bit more sophisticated. So our study, which was ably run by Sarah Lawton, who isn't here but may be watching us online. This was an enormous undertaking. We were recruiting patients when they consulted their GP with polymyalgia rheumatica, or PMR, and were diagnosed. We were asking them if they'd like to come into our study and complete some questionnaires, and could we please access their medical records as well. But because it's not common, it's not super rare, but it's not common, perhaps about 2 or 3% of people will have it in their lifetime. We were recruiting from all the primary care research networks, as they were then, in the country, bar one that was already recruiting to Helen's study in Sheffield. I can't see Helen, which is here. And then that meant we had over 350 general practices recruiting to this study. Only 297 of them actually recruited a patient. And then we wanted, as I said, to get their medical records as well. And the idea was that we were going to have some really complex data where we'd have 7 questionnaires over 2 years. We'd know if people had died. We'd have, with their medical records, we'd have everything they'd consulted for, their prescriptions, any blood tests or other investigations they'd had. So that was all quite complicated. And Sarah and other people in this clinical trials unit were running that very ably. So I then applied for my first grant as chief investigator, and I applied to the Royal College of General Practitioners Scientific Foundation Board. And it was a study using what was then called the GPRD. It's now known as CPRD, and I'll come back to that later. And our main question was, were people with PMR more likely to be diagnosed with cancer? The short answer was yes, but only in the short term. And this question arose not from us thinking that PMR causes cancer, but the symptoms can be very similar to early symptoms of certain cancers. And it's a very difficult condition in some ways to diagnose because there's not a test for it. I have never had results of a paper more misinterpreted. There is a group of researchers who are convinced that we said 70% of people with PMR get cancer within 6 months. What we'd said was they were 70% more likely than other people to get cancer within 6 months. And I went back and looked at the paper this week, and we did give them the numbers properly, because I thought maybe this is a real learning point for how to present your results. But no, I think we did do our best with it. But it led to being asked to lead a review for the Italian journal Rheumatismo on polymyalgia as a paraneoplastic syndrome, which means like early signs of cancer. So I was really starting to feel like a fraud at this point. And the study's still recruiting. So I went on maternity leave. So this is my oldest son, Ben, who is now looking quite embarrassed as a baby and more recently. And then I came back to work and made 2 failed attempts at fellowships, one from Wellcome and one from Arthritis Research UK, as it was then. And then I went on maternity leave again. This is Eric, who, as you can see, was quite overwhelmed by the size of his dummy in this picture. And while I was on maternity leave, really persuaded by Christian, I applied for a promotion to Senior Research Fellow. And reflecting on that now, I'm really glad I did, because the following years were very, very busy. There was a pandemic and all sorts of things, weren't there? So I'll leave that as a thought for now. So when I came back from having both children, Sarah and the CTU team had successfully recruited everybody to the study and followed them all up for 2 years. We didn't have medical record data. But what we showed in our first paper was that people really do find this condition difficult to live with. So they were reporting at the time of diagnosis that they scored 8 out of 10 for pain and for stiffness. And inflammatory conditions are generally thought to have morning stiffness. So stiffness when you wake up in the morning that eases off as you start moving. We showed that that was not the case with PMR, and people reported stiffness that was impeding what they were doing all day and all night. And as PMR papers go, this was reasonably easy to publish. We have trouble with the PMR papers. And then it was really well received, and we were awarded Research Paper of the Year in the musculoskeletal category by RCGP in 2016. And there you can see Sam and I receiving our certificate from Carolyn, who sat over there, and Helen Stokes-Lampard. And this project, once we'd got all the data collected, provided a really rich source of data for student projects. And one student came and worked with us, I think 3 times, and this is some of her work on patient information. So this is Martla's first paper, and she had at least 1 more, possibly 2, because she kept coming back to do more. And she showed that people got some information about PMR when they were diagnosed, having not heard about it before, but they would have liked some more. And we had lots of other medical students who came and did small projects like this with us, and more or less all of them have published that work, which means we got lots of extra information about PMR out there, and they got something that they really need to get their first jobs after graduation. Now, the main piece of work we did from this 2 years of follow-up was looking at clusters of pain and stiffness in this group. So this is a very clever piece of analysis where I worked with John Belcher and Becky Whittle, and we showed that there were probably 5 groups of people who experienced different patterns of symptoms over 5 years. The yellow line, which is about 1/3 of people, is what the textbook says you will be like if you've got PMR. So you'll feel really bad to start with. We'll give you some steroids, which I haven't mentioned is the treatment for PMR. You'll get better quickly and you'll stay better, and we'll get rid of your steroids over the next 18 months. That's what the textbooks say. But we showed that actually there's lots of different things that people experience. The red group, perhaps they didn't have PMR and their diagnosis may have been changed. We don't know that in this study. But some people got better more slowly, some got better and then started to get worse again. And this is the kind of picture that patients talk about when you speak to them about their PMR. So, doing all this work, I was asked to become a trustee at the patient charity PMR GCA UK in 2018. And I didn't realise that actually means becoming the director of a company. So it's quite responsible. But it was very interesting. When I first joined before the pandemic, I used to go to London 3 or 4 times a year for a meeting at Channel 4 because one of the other trustees worked there and she could get us a free room. It was lovely. This really increased the amount of work we could do with patients for our research. And led to additional funding from the NIHR that was co-led by the University of Leeds and the charity. And that was based, that question, it was called the PMR paradox study. And the paradox was that internationally, PMR is much more common in people from northern latitudes, so it's very common in Scandinavia, it's much less common in Italy and Spain. In the UK, this is data from Richard Partington's PhD, it's the other way round, so it's more common where it's darker on the map, not in London, but everywhere else in the south. And so Sarah Muller, who is a rheumatologist in Leeds, wanted to look at why that might be. And I was really fortunate to be involved in that study with her and with the charity as part of my role. That was alongside a member of the charity donating £50,000 with the express wish that it was used to fund research, and they'd never funded any research before. This is a really small charity with sort of 1.5 members of staff. And so, not on my own, but I worked with a couple of the other trustees to set up that call for funding and to award that money. And we were also successful in getting NIHR to accept the charity as a partner so that they can have portfolio adopted studies. So, 2017, I've just come back from maternity leave. We thought, why don't we make this quite complicated study a bit more complicated? We'll apply for some more money. And this time, Christian said, well, you lead this. So we wrote a funding bid to Arthritis Research, UK again, to ask people to complete one more questionnaire, and we wanted to extend that medical record review that we'd been planning. And really, we just wanted to know what happens to people over a longer period of time, because the guidelines say you get better quickly. That graph I showed a few slides ago clearly says not everybody does. Patients told us that wasn't the case, and actually some of Richard's work alongside the map said people take steroids for a lot longer. And so we were successful in getting that funding from March 2018 to February 2021. So we all know what happened 2 years into that study, which made it very complicated. But we also had an added complication that for ethical reasons we had to go back to all the practices and ask them if they'd still take part. There are 297 of them. Some of them had merged with each other or changed their names and done various other things. And then we had to get them to check when they'd agreed that their patients were still able to take part, so that they hadn't died and also that they didn't have advanced dementia or anything like that. So we got 197 people who were able to take part in this study from the 446 who'd been in our 2-year follow-up. So it's not quite what we'd have wanted, but it was enough for us to do something useful. And we showed that 40% of this group were still taking steroids, an average of 5 years after their diagnosis, which is nothing like the guideline treatment plan would suggest. What we wanted to be able to do was say who those people were who needed longer treatment, and we weren't able to do that, unfortunately. There was some suggestion maybe it was people who lived by themselves, which seems a little bit of a strange one to find, and maybe it's just spurious, but maybe there's more to it in terms of being able to cope with withdrawing your steroids and that kind of thing, and that remains open to question. We had quite a bit of trouble publishing this one. This was a lot more PMR-like. It went to lots of journals, ended up in one we probably wouldn't have chosen. And we submitted the abstract to the British Society of Rheumatology annual meeting in 2022, and it won the prize from the vasculitis SIG. And what I've come to realise is that PMR isn't of interest to the big journals often, but it really is of interest to people who work with patients with PMR, because they recognise that it's not simple, even though lots of people who are less familiar with it think that it's easy to sort out. A more recent paper, and this is the last one on this cohort, we looked at body maps of the proportions of people that have got pain in different parts of their body, and you can see in the top left that they really do have, people have a lot more shoulder pain, or a lot more people with PMR have shoulder pain than in the general population. So this gets, as we go over time, we go through the study, and the bottom corner is from the Norstop study that I used for my PhD. And you can see by 1 month after, so the second box on the top line, by 1 month after your diagnosis, you look pretty much like the general population once you've got your steroids going. But then you have to try and stop them. So that was another paper where we'd worked with medical students. Niall, who led that work, was a medical student, and Henna, who is also an author, was actually a biomedical science student that I taught in the School of Life Sciences and had come and said, can I do some research in the summer, please? Unfortunately, the biomed students don't get funding the way the medical students do, but she still managed to do some. And so it was lovely to have that, that opportunity to work with two students on one piece of work. So, alongside the PMR, I've been working in electronic health records for probably about 15 years, perhaps longer than that actually. And this is our Keele Health and Care Data Research Network, which has been renamed recently because Chris said our old name wasn't very nice. And this is a picture of us at our away day, and I'm part of the leadership group for this research network, which is led by Kaylee, who's here. And we do a lot of work using the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, or CPRD, and this is the update to the GPRD where we did our work looking at PMR and cancer a long time ago. And I do lots of different pieces of research on different topics using this data because it's not topic specific. It's GP medical records in a massive dump of 60 million people's records. And we've used lots of that data in our inflammatory rheumatic disease research group, which used to be known as GRAPE for gout, rheumatoid arthritis and polymyalgia rheumatica. We now include other types of inflammatory arthritis and a bit less gout than we used to. So we've rebranded a bit. And that work was all led by Sam, who I was already working with on the PMR work, Ed Roddy, and more recently, but not that much more recently actually, by Ian Scott, who's our inflammatory arthritis person. So I just picked out a couple of things that I've worked on in this group. On the left-hand side, there's two papers from a single project looking at this is more big words, the safety of prescribing colchicine or NSAIDs, they're things like ibuprofen, as prophylaxis, like preventative medicine, for having a flare of gout when you start your long-term treatment to stop you having flares of gout. So there's lots of things to get your head around as a statistician when you start talking to some clinicians. So we've initially submitted this project naively saying that we would look at two bits of CPRD called gold and aurum, so they contain the same data but they're from different computer systems. If you don't need to do that, don't do that. It's at least 3 times as much work as just doing it for one database. Also, when the funder says, could you, as well as just looking at colchicine, which is what we'd said we were going to do, could you do NSAIDs as well? Don't agree just because you want them to fund it. Because that was then twice as much work as what we were already proposing, because it wasn't just an add something in, it was do it again in parallel. And Ed and I agreed afterwards that that made it harder. But this study started in 2019, and so we did this while learning to work remotely, juggling childcare, and not me, but colleagues' extra clinical duties. It felt like the project that was never going to end. So I'm really glad when we got 2 lovely papers out of that. And then on the graph, I just thought it'd be nice to show you some actual data. This is work I did with Ian and Becky, and it's just the number of new diagnoses, or the rates of new diagnoses of rheumatoid arthritis from 2004 to 2020. And you can see it's bubbling along quite nicely, and then it looks like it goes up quite a bit in 2012, which we think is to do with when GPs were paid differently for how they record things. Not that they were doing a bad job before, they were just better at putting the code in once they were getting paid around the disease. And then in 2020, you can see the pandemic effect of people not having the same access to care. So just taking a bit of a pause from my research, around the same time I was trying to complete that gout project, Christian had suggested to me the ARC, which was the Applied Research Collaboration in the West Midlands. This is a huge research infrastructure project led by the University of Birmingham, but including us, Warwick, and lots of trusts as well. They want a deputy lead for capacity development in each site. Why don't you apply? So I did. And that was fine. I spent a year working with my counterparts at Warwick and Birmingham and the capacity development lead, Aileen Clark, who was at Warwick. And we did a couple of away days for early career researchers and that kind of thing. It was really nice. And then I got an email off Aileen that said, I'm retiring. I think you should take over. And I thought, I don't think she's right there. She's got that wrong. So I didn't reply for a few days. And I got another email, Sarah, you need to take over. Go and speak to Richard Lilford, he's the boss of the project. And he said, yes, you're doing it. So that was probably a steeper learning curve than any research I've ever done. I was suddenly going to these weekly operations meetings for a piece of infrastructure I didn't really understand at that point. I was going to executive level meetings where we were being scrutinised by independent panels, and all these things all at once, and I didn't know what I was doing. Well, I did by the end, but I started off really not knowing what I was doing. There is something about learning by doing, isn't there? Also lots of new words and acronyms that I didn't understand. But it gave me lots of links into other groups of people, into understanding how things work that aren't necessarily obvious when you're just working by yourself, and allowed me, in the last 18 months or so, 2 years now, to set up a pre-application support fund in our region. So we had money from the NHR where we could allocate funding to people to enable them to buy out some time to write fellowship applications. And we made 17 awards, and it was really, really difficult to do. But it was very rewarding to see people coming back and saying, I've now just been awarded a fellowship because of that money that I was able to have. And so I think, although it was very challenging, I actually learned an awful lot from that. But I want to dip back into research. You might have noticed when I put the pictures up of my maternity leave, I only included a baby picture of Eric with the big dummy. And that was a clue. Eric's got a very small head. And that's because when he was 5, we found out he's got Angelman syndrome. And we knew before that he had, sorry, he is fine, I promise. Look, he's over there. We knew he had developmental delay, and he was diagnosed about the same time I took on the capacity development role and completed the gout project and all the other things. And I decided I wanted to do something with my experience, and so I've been contributing to Keel's learning disability nursing and children's nursing teaching programmes as somebody with lived experience as a carer of a child with learning disability. And then I started to do some work through the ARC with people at Warwick and Birmingham who do learning disability research. And then I had an idea. So when I take my children to the doctors, I don't think they necessarily get treated in the same way for the same things. That's not to say I think one of them's treated better than the other, it was just different. And I commented on this to Christian and to Richard, and they said, well, yeah, we probably do give out antibiotics a bit more easily because we're a bit more worried. A bit rubbish at checking blood pressure in older people. And so we wrote a grant. And this is a little bit like the asthma thing. It was a bit of a foray into something new, and they funded it first time. So I spent a really enjoyable morning last Friday with this group of people. This is the Talk and Change group at the Combined NHS Trust. And Jessica, who's at the back there, and I took the findings of our project so far, with thanks to Michelle for organising us, to this group. And they told us why they thought we'd found what we'd found and what we might like to do about it. So if you're a GP, you need a body map so people can point to it and tell you where it hurts. That's what they wanted. They were so insightful and sensible. It was the best morning I've had in ages. So just very quickly touching back on PMR before I finish. This is work that we've published recently on PMR, but using the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, the CPRD. I'm not going to take credit for the analysis. That was done by David, who was working with us at the time, and led by Helen. But we emulated 2 clinical trials in the routinely collected data. So these are studies that we don't think you could really do in practice, and so it's worth us trying to do them as well as we can in the routinely collected data. And we showed that it probably is worth taking bone protection medicine if you're taking steroids for PMR. So for every 100 people that take bone protection, about one person will be prevented from having a fracture. People are often given stomach protection as well, because steroids can increase the risk of your stomach bleeding. We didn't really see any benefit to that in this group of people. But half of them were already taking one. So this was about starting one fresh. And I think this is an area that we might want to do more about from a methodological point of view. So how do we do trials in routinely collected data? So finally, what am I going to do now? I think we've still got lots of work to do on how we make life better for people with PMR. There is a need for trials, but whether that's drug trials, which I think is what patient groups want, and possibly what some rheumatologists want, or whether it's about how we just look after people better. And Helen and Toby are both leading work in that area at the moment. I'm particularly interested in how we might do some trials in routinely collected data, not instead of doing clinical trials, but as well when it's the better way to answer a question, or the only way, maybe. Learning disability research isn't something we specialise in at Keele, but it's something that I think could have a place, and we've certainly got an event that we're running where we'll have people with learning disability and interested professionals as well as carers coming to in the autumn, and we're going to discuss where the current work might lead us. I should have said, what we've shown is that people with learning disability consult less frequently for things you can't see. So for pain, musculoskeletal pain, for headaches, that kind of thing. But I'm not sure whether we will end up going down the route of us leading more learning disability research. It might be that it's a collaboration with somebody else, or it might be that it becomes a focus for our research inclusion work. When we're doing routinely collected data studies, why don't we look specifically at the subgroup of people with learning disability, like we look at males and females separately, or like we look at ethnicity and deprivation? And finally, the capacity development work that I'm very fortunate to have had so many people, probably people sitting in this room, that I have not commented on their role in my development in the last 20 odd years. So thank you to everybody. And unfortunately we no longer have an ARC in the West Midlands, but we do have a mental health research group led by Carolyn, who's here, and Gary, and I will be supporting the capacity development in that for the next 5 years. So thank you for coming, and that'd be where I am.